Imagine living alone, believing that the silence of night is your safety net. Then, at exactly 2:14 a.m., you hear the sound of a door handle slowly rattling. You freeze, your heart racing, and through the thin crack in your blinds, you see the silhouette of a man just standing there. No words, no movement, just watching. The police arrive, but they tell you there's nothing they can do. No crime has been committed. And when they leave, the nightmare begins again. Because the truth is, some horrors don't end with flashing lights. They wait in the shadows, smiling at the cameras, pressing their filthy hands against your windows, and slipping notes that say, "The cops leave, but I don't." This isn't fiction. These are disturbing true stories where help never came. You think you're safe because you can dial 911? Think again. When the authorities walk away, you're left alone with the thing that stalks you. And sometimes, survival means running before it's too late. Welcome to the price paid. Subscribe now if you dare, because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after the video ends. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After a messy breakup and years of living with roommates, I finally signed the lease on a small townhouse tucked into a quiet cul-de-sac in southern Illinois. The place wasn't anything special, beige siding, manicured hedges, and cookie-cutter mailboxes with family names stenciled on the side. Most of the neighbors were older couples or young families. The streets were calm, the night silent, and for the first time in my life, I was living alone.
It's right there.
At 27, I told myself I was ready for it, but deep down, I was nervous. That nervousness would soon turn into something far darker. The first time I noticed him, I tried not to think much of it. A tall, heavy-set man in his 40s with a scruffy beard, standing outside his unit 3 doors down. He wasn't doing anything. Sometimes he smoked, sometimes he paced, but often he just stood there staring at the road or at nothing at all. When I pulled into my driveway late at night after work, I would see him leaning against the railing, his eyes following me. He never smiled. He never waved. He simply watched. At first, I convinced myself he was harmless, a night owl. Maybe insomnia. Maybe he worked a late shift too. Friends told me I was paranoid. But it wasn't the fact that he was outside, it was the way he was outside. No phone, no distraction, no movement. He stood like a statue, as if waiting for something. The more I noticed him, the more my gut told me something wasn't right. Then the noises began. It was mid-September when I woke at 2:37 a.m. to a strange sound. Metal scraping wood, followed by the slow creak of hinges. I lay frozen, realizing it was coming from the back of the house, near the sliding glass door that led into my fenced-in yard. My heart pounded as I heard footsteps crunching on gravel. The entire yard was lined with stone instead of grass, so every step was loud, deliberate. I knew it wasn't an animal. I reached for the only thing I had in my nightstand, a dull kitchen knife that suddenly felt useless. I crept to the blinds and peeked through. Nothing. The motion light didn't trigger. Whoever was out there had avoided it. Or maybe they were standing just out of sight. Terrified, I dialed 911. The dispatcher kept me calm until 2 officers arrived. They searched the yard, found nothing, and told me it was probably a raccoon. One of them gave me a look like I was wasting their time. They left. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked the gate myself. That's when I saw Ida flat stone wedged at the base, keeping it from closing all the way. The gate had a heavy spring that normally shut it tight. Someone had deliberately placed that rock so they could slip back in without making noise. I called the police again. They noted it, but said unless there was damage or forced entry, there was nothing they could do. 2 nights later, it escalated. At 2:14 a.m., I woke to the sound of my back door handle jiggling. First soft, then harder, as if someone was testing it. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched in the hallway, clutching the knife. Through a gap in the blinds, I saw a shadow moving across the window. A man. He didn't run, didn't hide. He stood there. By the time the police arrived, there were footprints in the gravel leading up to the door, but again, they told me no crime had been committed. I bought cameras the next day. That night, I sat in the dark, watching the live feed. At 2:23 a.m., the screen lit up. A man in a black hoodie, jeans, and gloves stepped into the frame. He moved carefully, like he knew the blind spots. He walked up to the door, looked directly into the camera, and smiled. A slow, stretched grin that sent chills through my spine. Then he backed away into the darkness. I called the police again. They watched the footage and admitted it was unsettling, but still insisted there was nothing they could legally do. He hadn't broken in, hadn't damaged property, hadn't threatened me. Their hands were tied. That night I left and slept in a hotel. When I returned the next day, 4 muddy handprints smeared across the glass door greeted me. Too high, too low, as if someone crouched there, pressing their palms against the glass, watching me sleep. That was the moment I decided I couldn't stay. I broke the lease, forfeited my deposit, and packed up. The final straw was the note. Wedged into my mailbox on the day I left, scrawled in cramped handwriting, "The cops leave, but I don't." I filed one last report. This time the officer looked disturbed, but by then it didn't matter. I was gone. Weeks later, a message popped up on Facebook. It was from a girl named Kayla, the new tenant who had taken over my unit. She asked, "Did you ever have someone in a black hoodie hanging around the backyard? I keep hearing footsteps at night. Last night, someone knocked on the glass door around 2 a.m. and just stood there." I didn't reply, because the truth was, I already knew the answer. The job was supposed to be simple. Drive out to a foreclosed house, take inventory, clean it up, secure it for the winter, and move on. That was the routine. I'd been doing it for years as part of a property preservation crew. Most days were mindless, dusty furniture, overgrown yards, empty rooms echoing with the ghosts of families who had once lived there. Sometimes it was sad, sometimes boring, but never dangerous. Until that one house in rural upstate New York in 2020. The town itself felt like a photograph fading in the sun. One gas station, shuttered storefronts, cracked roads swallowed by weeds. No traffic, no noise, no eyes watching, except maybe the trees. The property I was assigned to was a small one-story house at the end of a dirt road. Overgrown brush surrounded it, the woods pressing in on 3 sides. No neighbors, no sign of life. According to the file, the elderly owner had passed away, and no one claimed the estate. The utilities had been shut off for over a year. When I arrived that Monday morning with my small box truck, the place looked intact enough. Roof fine, windows closed, just vines creeping up the porch. The door stuck in the frame, swollen from months of humidity. I shoved it open and stepped inside, breathing in a stale mix of dust and mildew. Standard job, I thought. Just another empty house. Then my work phone rang. It startled me because I'd already checked my signal out there, no bars. But the phone buzzed anyway. The caller ID just said, "Unknown." I answered, nothing. Just a low crackle of static, like an old radio, out of tune. "Hello?" I said twice. Dead air. I hung up, chalking it up to some glitch. I started with photos, documenting every room as required. The living room looked like a time capsule lace curtains, heavy wooden furniture, porcelain figurines lined up on a dusty mantel. It smelled faintly metallic under the mildew. Down the hall, one bedroom was empty except for a sagging mattress. Another looked like a sewing room. A corkboard on the wall caught my eye. It was filled with old obituary clippings, dozens of them carefully cut and pinned. All local names, none familiar. Then the master bedroom. On the nightstand sat a rotary phone off white, yellowed with age, the kind you almost never see anymore. The line was long since dead. No dial tone, no service. I paused, staring at it, before moving on. In the bathroom, my phone rang again. Same unknown caller. This time when I answered, it wasn't static. It was a whisper, so faint I could barely hear it. "Don't answer the phone in the bedroom." Then silence. The line went dead. I froze. The house was silent. Windows closed. No one outside. My first thought was a prank. Maybe someone on the crew messing with me. But no one else knew I was there that early.
Noted.
And with no signal? How? My phone flickered between one bar and none. Calls to my supervisor failed. I tried to focus on my work, boxing up books and figurines, but the entire time, I felt like I was being watched. I kept glancing at the hallway, expecting to see someone standing there. The house seemed to breathe around me, every creak of the floor like a footstep. Then I heard the ring of a phone. Not my phone. The rotary phone in the bedroom. A shrill mechanical bell echoing down the hallway. That phone should have been dead. The line was disconnected. Yet it rang again and again. I walked toward it, heart pounding. The receiver trembled slightly with each ring. I didn't dare pick it up. Eventually it stopped. I backed out of the room, my hands slick with sweat. Part of me wanted to leave, but part of my job was securing the basement. I hesitated at the door, flashlight in hand. Pride or stupidity, I don't know which, pushed me forward. The basement stairs groaned under my weight. The air smelled like mold and rust. Shelves lined the walls with old paint cans and broken furniture. In the back corner sat a small table. On it was a cordless phone, a newer model, gray plastic covered in dust. Next to it, a stack of yellowed notebooks. I picked one up and flipped through. Each page listed a name, a date, and a short sentence. Lena H. July 3rd, 2019. Rang once, didn't answer. Carl M. September 12th, 2019. Picked up, warned him. Dozens of entries like this. The words blurred as my heart thudded in my chest. The basement felt wrong. Heavy. Like the darkness itself was aware of me. I dropped the notebook and spun around, scanning the corners with my flashlight. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. I bolted up the stairs, every instinct screaming at me to get out. I didn't finish the job. I drove straight back to the office and turned in my report, claiming the property was unsafe and possibly had squatters. They reassigned it to another crew. 2 days later, Mark, a guy from our team, texted me. He'd gone out there that morning to finish what I'd started. I hadn't told him what happened. His message said, "The phone in the bedroom with no service rang while I was in there. What the hell?" I called him immediately. He told me he didn't answer it. He was too freaked out. The next day, Mark quit without notice. I found him on Facebook later. He was alive, posting updates, but we never spoke again. My boss eventually called the police to report potential squatters after Mark quit. They checked the house. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No one inside. But I'll never forget that house. The way the phone rang when it shouldn't have. The whisper that warned me. The names in the notebook. Either it was an elaborate prank or something else entirely. Something that waited for people to come alone, far from help. And I still wonder what would have happened if I'd picked up that phone. The rental house was old, but that was fine with me. I was in my late 20s, working nights as a security guard, and I needed something affordable. The place had creaky floors, thin walls, and a small backyard. Nothing special, but it came with a basement. I told myself I could use the extra space for tools, boxes, and old furniture. That decision would haunt me. The basement door was in the hallway next to the bathroom. It stuck a little when you opened it, heavy wood groaning on rusty hinges. The worst part was the light switch. It wasn't at the top of the stairs. You had to walk down a few steps in complete darkness before you could flick it on. The first time I went down, I felt uneasy. Not scared exactly, but there was something about the way the air hung thick and damp that made me want to get out quickly. The single bulb barely lit the corners. The smell was old wood and dust. I stored my things, shut the door, and forgot about it. Until late October. I had just come home from work. It was around 3 a.m, and I was heading to the bathroom before bed when I heard it. 3 soft knocks that came from behind the basement door. I froze in the hallway, staring at the door, waiting. Silence followed. My rational brain tried to explain it. Pipes. The house settling. But then I heard it again. 3 distinct knocks. I backed away, heart pounding, whispering to myself that it was nothing. I didn't open the door. Instead, I locked my bedroom and stayed awake for hours, the sound replaying in my head. The next morning, I forced myself to check. I opened the basement door, descended the steps, and turned on the light. Everything was the way I left it. Dust untouched, windows sealed, nothing disturbed. I told myself it had to be the house. I wanted to believe that. A few nights later, the sound returned. This time it was different. Just one knock, but loud, hard. I stopped brushing my teeth and stepped into the hallway. The basement door was shut, motionless. Slowly, I pressed my ear to the wood. At first, silence. Then, faintly, I heard breathing. Slow, steady, unmistakably human. I backed away, my stomach turning. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called my landlord. He came by, skeptical, but agreed to check. We both went into the basement together. He inspected the windows, walls, and foundation. Nothing. No animals, no signs of forced entry. He laughed it off. I didn't. For a week, things were quiet. I let myself relax, telling myself I was overtired, working too many night shifts. Then, one night at 2 a.m, I was watching TV when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The basement door creaked open. It wasn't a knock this time. It was the slow, unmistakable grind of the hinges moving. I muted the TV, straining to listen. The sound continued, long and deliberate. I turned my head toward the hallway. The basement door was wide open. I hadn't touched it in a week. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward it. My heart thudded in my chest with every step. I leaned over the threshold and shined the light down. Darkness swallowed the beam. The bulb wasn't on. That's when I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate footsteps climbing the stairs. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut. For a moment, I felt pressure on the other side, like something was pushing back. Then it stopped. I locked the door and called the police. My voice shook as I told him someone was in my basement. 2 officers arrived 10 minutes later. They searched the house, went into the basement, and emerged empty-handed. Nothing. No signs of entry, no disturbance. One of them even joked, asking if I'd been watching horror movies. They left me with no answers. The next morning, I bought a padlock and installed it on the door. I didn't care what the landlord thought. I needed it. For a month, everything was quiet. No knocks, no breathing, no footsteps. I almost convinced myself it was over. Then, one night, I returned from work to find the basement door open. The padlock lay broken on the floor. I froze in the hallway. I hadn't touched that lock since I installed it. The door was ajar, darkness yawning inside. That was when it clicked in my mind. Every knock, every noise, every creak hit had only ever happened at night. Only when I was home. I couldn't bring myself to go down there. I packed a bag and left, staying at a friend's place for days. When I returned, I nailed the basement door shut. I even wedged a chair against it. I didn't care how ridiculous it looked. Then came the night I'll never forget. Around 3 in the morning, I lay in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. Not a knock, not footsteps, a voice. It was faint, low, like a rumble deep in someone's throat. The sound came from beneath the floorboards, directly under my bed. That was the final straw. I called the police again. They searched. Nothing, no explanation. I left that house within days, abandoning furniture, tools, everything I had stored in the basement. I didn't even wait for the lease to end. I don't know what was in that basement. I don't want to know. But sometimes, lying awake at night in my new apartment, I think about it. I think about the broken lock, the sound of footsteps climbing the stairs, and that voice rumbling under my bed. And I wonder if I had stayed just a little longer, what would have come up from that darkness. When you look at these 3 stories side by side, a pattern emerges. At first glance, they seem completely different. One person stalked by a neighbor, another haunted by a dead house ringing with impossible phone calls, and another plagued by footsteps and whispers from a basement. But beneath the details lies a terrifying truth. Sometimes, the most horrifying part of the story is not the intruder, not the house, not the voice. It is the helplessness when no one will believe you, and no one can help. The woman in Illinois did everything right. She locked her doors, called the police multiple times, and even installed cameras. She gathered evidence, handed it to the authorities, and still, they shrugged and said there was nothing they could do. The man in the black hoodie smiled into her camera, left muddy handprints on her glass door, and slipped a note into her mailbox that made her blood turn cold. The message was clear. The police could leave, but he never would. For her, safety meant fleeing her own home, abandoning money, belongings, and peace of mind. What stayed behind was something worse than an intruder. It was the knowledge that someone had chosen her, and that even law enforcement couldn't stop him. The worker in New York thought he was stepping into an empty house, only to find himself drawn into something inexplicable. The ringing phone, the whispered warning, the notebooks full of names. They created a trap of dread that even his rational mind couldn't escape. His body reacted before his thoughts could catch up. He fled. His co-worker Mark, who had no idea what he was walking into, experienced the same unnatural ringing and quit his job soon after. Again, the police investigated, but they found nothing. For the men who went inside, the horror wasn't just in the sound of a phone that should not have been ringing. It was the realization that whatever force lingered in that house wasn't bound by ordinary rules. You can't arrest a voice. You can't handcuff a whisper. And then there's the man with the basement. His story is every renter's nightmare. A house with quirks becomes a house with secrets. The knocks, the breathing, the creak of a door opening on its own, the steady climb of footsteps on stairs, all of it pointed to something real, something physical. Yet every time he reached for help, the police found nothing. For weeks, he lived with the dread that something unseen was watching him, pushing against the door, waiting for the right night to come through. His solution was not victory. It was survival. He nailed the basement shut and finally abandoned the place. In all 3 cases, the police could not intervene. Not because they didn't want to, but because the system itself is bound by rules. No break-in, no damage, no crime, no action. And that is the core of the horror. When the thing in the night doesn't play by the rules of law, the law cannot fight it. You can be followed, stalked, stared at, whispered to, and still, no one in authority will raise a hand until blood is spilled. By then, it may be too late. What ties these stories together is the moment of realization, the sickening clarity that you are on your own. You can beg for help, file reports, even show evidence. But when the lights of the police car fade down the street, you are left in the silence with the danger still outside, or worse, already inside. It is a kind of isolation that eats at your sanity. How do you sleep knowing the same man will be back tomorrow? How do you finish your work when the house itself whispers warnings? How do you live above a basement that growls with a voice not your own? These are not stories with triumphant endings. No one conquered the threat. No villain was arrested, no ghost exorcised, no monster slain. The endings are flight, abandonment, escaping with your life while leaving behind a piece of yourself. The price is always paid in fear, in sleepless nights, in the permanent unease of knowing that you were chosen by something relentless. And maybe the most chilling part is this. Each story could happen to anyone. A strange neighbor, a job in an empty house, a rental with a basement. Ordinary details, familiar settings, until something shifts, until you hear a knock that isn't supposed to be there, until the phone rings though it should be dead, until footsteps climb the stairs when no one is home. Horror does not need the supernatural. Horror only needs disbelief, silence, and the moment you realize that no one can protect you. Because in the end, when the cops leave, when your friends laugh it off, when your landlord shrugs, there is only you and the thing that will not stop. And that is the truth behind these disturbing encounters. The terror that lingers is not just the man in the hoodie, or the ringing phone, or the dark basement. It is the knowledge that when help cannot help, survival is entirely in your hands. What do these three disturbing stories teach us? More than just chills and goosebumps, they reveal something profoundly unsettling about life, safety, and the limits of protection. We grow up believing that the police, the laws, and the systems we trust will be there when we need them most. We believe that if something feels wrong, if someone is watching us, if danger creeps into our homes, we can simply call for help. But these stories prove a darker truth. Sometimes the help we expect will not come. The woman in Illinois discovered this when her stalker smiled into her camera, left handprints on her glass, and dropped a note that made her skin crawl. She had done everything right, called the authorities, filed reports, documented evidence, yet the officers told her there was nothing they could do because no crime had been committed. The horror wasn't just the man outside her door, but the realization that even law enforcement couldn't shield her. Her only option was to run. The property worker in New York found himself in a nightmare without logic. Phones rang when the lines were dead. Voices whispered warnings that no one should have heard. And notebooks recorded conversations that blurred the line between reality and something darker. His fear was not only of what he experienced, but of the fact that no one would ever truly believe him. How do you convince someone that the impossible happened in an abandoned house? How do you explain that the sound of a bell made you feel like your life was in danger? Again, the police came, shrugged, and left, and the house kept its secrets. Then there was the tenant with the basement. He heard knocks, then breathing, then footsteps, then a voice rumbling beneath his bed. Each time he called for help, each time the house was searched, there was nothing to report. He was left alone in a place he no longer trusted, forced to abandon everything just to reclaim a sense of safety. These stories are terrifying not just because of the events, but because of what they represent. The isolation of being trapped in danger when no one else will acknowledge it. The monsters, whether human or something unexplainable, thrive in that gap between what you know is happening and what others refuse to see. That gap leaves you vulnerable, powerless, and ultimately alone. So what can we take from this? Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Protect yourself. Prepare for the unexpected. And never ignore that gnawing sense that danger is near. Because sometimes the scariest part of a nightmare isn't the shadow at your window, or the voice in your basement tits, realizing you are the only one who truly understands the threat. This is the essence of true horror. Not ghosts or demons or mass killers, but the cold truth that when you need help the most, it might not arrive. And in that moment, your survival depends on how quickly you act, how much you trust your own fear, and how far you're willing to go to escape. Welcome to The Price Paid. Subscribe now if you dare, because the next story could be yours.